This is the Project Management Podcast. We bring project management topics to beginners and experts. Find us on the web at www.thepmpodcast.com or send your emails to pmpodcast@gmail.com.
Hello and welcome to episode number 115. I am Cornelius Fichtner. This is the Project Management Podcast for the 6th of March 2009. Nice to have you with us. One major factor that is making large projects more difficult to manage than small projects is, of course, complexity. On a large project, you will have a larger project scope, a more extensive budget, a more intricate project schedule, and not least of it all, also a lot more people. And all of these add to your project's complexity. Stan Levanduski argues that the linear way of managing a small project does not scale up to a large project. Large projects have exponentially more complexity, and therefore they require a different, non-linear approach. He and I did a 4.5-hour-long PM lecture on this topic, and in this interview we want to give you a glimpse into the complexity of complexity. Stan is also the co-author of a book called The Advantage of Leadership, and you can find the book at theadvantageofleadershipnow.com. On this page, you'll not only get a discount to the book, but also a number of free audio downloads. And here is the man himself, Stan Levanduski, on leadership challenges of complex projects. Good morning, Stan, and thank you very much for coming back onto the Project Management Podcast.
Good morning, Cornelius. It's great to be here again. Thank you.
Wonderful. We both have our cups of tea at hand, and we want to talk about complexity today. So let me start out with the simplest and probably also most difficult question. What is complexity, Stan?
Well, Cornelius, there's all kinds of different issues around complexity, of course, depending on what book you read and what dictionary you look at. But the way we're talking about complexity with project management comes from the field of complexity science, and it meshes together kind of closely with some topics in chaos theory. And the type of complexity that we're looking at here is the interaction of many, many different types of apparently independent elements. So that's the type of complexity that we're talking about, very complex interactions.
I see. What dimensions are we talking about here? What dimensions does complexity have?
Well, in the way we use it in project management, it doesn't have any dimensions that you can measure on there, like to say this is 3 feet of complexity versus a mile of complexity. But complexity can be quantified on a relative basis, just on a kind of numerical scale, maybe a range of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, just based on looking at the dynamics of these interactions. So that's probably the best way to explain the dimension of complexity. The more interactions, the more complex. The bigger the project, with more interactions, the more complex, and then it starts to kind of get exponential.
Okay, that's a great segue, because my next question for you is, where do you see the main difference in leadership challenges, and we're talking about leadership challenges here, that a project manager faces on a small project versus a larger, complex project?
Right. Well, the question is all about leadership, isn't it?
Yes.
And one of the things we talked quite a bit about is the difference between leadership and management. And on smaller projects that are not complex, or maybe that are difficult but not yet into this realm of complexity or highly complex, one of the things we found is you can get by with some pretty fundamental management approaches. But by the time you get up to large, complex projects, the emphasis needs to be more on leadership techniques. That is, the soft skills, the people-to-people techniques, rather than the pure technical skills of management. And I think that is oftentimes a difficult transition people have is being, especially in technology areas, is being very, very skilled at the technical issues and the management side, and then suddenly have to move over to the soft side to dealing more with pure people things. That, I think, is probably the most difficult area.
But doesn't that also start a lot earlier in the project when you have a complex project? I mean, doesn't that start in planning already? Can we still use the tried and true linear planning approaches that we have on today's small and medium-sized projects when we suddenly are handed this highly complex project?
Well, you're right. It does start back in the planning. And the answer about the linear plan is, well, no, not really, unless you do certain things. Any of the planning tools, most of the planning tools that people would be familiar with, things like Microsoft Project, for instance, which is, of course, the 800-pound gorilla of project planning, or any of the other common tools that people refer to, we all understand the critical path method of planning, and they all use a technique that's called deterministic planning, which allows you to basically lay out linear paths through the project. It's very predictable, and it's an excellent technique on the smaller projects. The problem when we get to the larger and complex projects is that we're not working in a linear world. There's a lot of these dynamic interactions that we talked about, and you generally have to move to more of something called probabilistic planning, which it gets into some of the advanced techniques. For instance, Monte Carlo is one that anybody who has a PMP had to know a little bit about Monte Carlo to get your PMP credential, but not many people really understand how to put it into practice. So,
have you personally used Monte Carlo on projects?
Oh, I have a lot. And if this is one of the things I look at for project success, is you've got to be able to understand when you're in a linear mode or when you're in a probabilistic mode. And I've used Monte Carlo on everything from software development projects to very, very large product development projects. It works very, very well. It's a different way of thinking, and you kind of have to condition your customer or your management or your executives to what it's telling you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that because everybody is used to linear approaches. I mean, our world is linear. B follows A, C follows B. That's just the way it goes, and suddenly we're asking them to understand and believe what the Monte Carlo technique is telling us. How do you manage suddenly your customers, your sponsors, when you've got these complex projects and, well, things are no longer linear, things are a bit more fluid? How do you do that? What is your approach?
Well, the way I do it is, of course, Monte Carlo is heavily involved with statistics. And the nice thing about the Monte Carlo engines that we have available today, the ones that interact very, very nicely with Excel and Microsoft Project, for instance, is you don't have to be a statistician or a math major to use them. If you can use Microsoft Project, you can use the Monte Carlo tools. But when you're explaining this to people, and trying to get them to understand what it means, you can't be too enamored with the mathematics or even the Monte Carlo process. I mean, it produces some wonderful output. It's in my opinion, is all about not the tool and not the Monte Carlo process, but explaining what the output means and how you arrived at it. In other words, being able to articulate these are the input conditions. This is why this is so. And it's very much a black box approach. We put things in the left side and stuff comes out the right side. And customer, boss, whomever, this is what it means. And it really comes down to being able to explain things that happen more in ranges rather than in absolute numbers.
Are we talking about expectation management here?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And I've used it both. I've used it both ways. People have said, "Oh, we want this. We want this project to finish on April 30th." And what's that looking like? So with expectations, if you use this correctly, you can look at it and say, well, we can get it done on April 30th, but we're only going to have a 40% chance of getting that done. Now, if we expand the range a little bit more, that gets us up to a higher level of confidence. So I try to never say no. No, we can't do it by April 30th. It's more like, yes, we could do it by April 30th, but here's the consequences of that decision, and here's some ways to improve the odds.
Okay, so one of the possible ways of changing our planning approaches is to get away from the linear and move over to a more Monte Carlo oriented approach. We've talked about the sponsor, we talked about the customer, but there is a whole team of people on our complex project, and I can see that there must be a major difference also between managing your team when we're talking about small, quote unquote, easy projects versus these highly complex projects. What are some of the differences, some of the approaches that you use in managing the team members on a complex project?
That's a great question, and this is going to relate a little bit back to what we've talked about also with the linear planning.
Yes.
One of the things that I think it's important to realize happens is with complex projects, it's not really one project. It really is a collection of many smaller projects underneath. And in fact, in the way organizations often plan this out, they sort of not knowingly get the project structured this way. And probably the best example of this is where you see projects that are very geographically dispersed. We have a developer in India, and we have some manufacturing over in Europe, and we have product development going on in Texas, and it tends to look like very, very independent projects. And in fact, they probably are independent to some extent. And if you are working with smaller independent projects, if you could break this down, then you can fairly successfully use linear planning on those smaller projects. The big thing that I think is required absolutely for the complex projects is to realize that these seemingly independent projects really are not independent. They drive very, very critical interdependencies between the projects. And the way I approach this is by finding some really good project managers for the lower level projects. And to some extent, at the lower level projects, planning and acting in more of a linear mode is fine. But what the challenge is when you bring these together to form the program or the big complex project, is to realize that the dependencies between these are very, very critical, and they will drive the schedule and the risk on your big complex projects.
I see. So let me see if I get this right here. So you have a large, complex project that does in fact consist of multiple smaller projects that are, call them sub-projects, that are happening throughout the world or throughout your company, however the setup may be. And even though they may look like they're a bit independent, there are interconnections. There are interfaces between those projects, and in order to manage those better, you just put very skilled project managers on each of those projects, making sure that they talk to each other, that they stand their interfaces, and that they drive their projects to deliver whatever the interface needs, and thereby ensuring that you stay on schedule. Is that about it?
That's about it. Except,
sounds very easy.
Well, what I was just going to add to that is that's about it, except that the job of the the program, the complex manager, really becomes managing those interfaces and dependencies.
Yes.
It's that is very, very critical, and here's why. When the big project gets broken down into these smaller ones, and you assign project managers, whether it's just around your company or around the world, they will tend to look at these projects as very, very independent. This is my project here, and someone over in the UK, Sally in the UK has this project, and they look at them as basically isolated. And even though it's easy to see that some deliverables or information must flow from one project to the other,
yes,
because they do get so geographically and diversely separated, what I've experienced is the project managers don't feel there's any need to pick up the telephone or to communicate with the other project managers. So essentially, the program manager, the leader of the complex project, needs to take on that role, this coordination role of managing those interfaces and all of this information that's got to flow between the projects, setting up a structure to allow that to happen very, very easily.
Mm-hmm. And I assume we're just now talking about the deliverables, about those interfaces and interactions that you actually see. But I suppose there are also those that you don't see and that only become apparent once they fail.
That's absolutely true. And the more you can get the leaders talking to each other and understanding that there are these dependencies that must happen, you can create a situation where the problems will almost take care of themselves if the structure is right. Mm-hmm. And this is something else we've talked about in our other interviews of being able to put several different types of structures in place to allow communications to happen, to allow information flow to happen, and basically to allow things to, I won't say happen spontaneously, but for people to communicate as the need arises rather than to have such tight control over everything.
Mm. Wonderful. This discussion today that we're having right now is, of course, only a very, very small portion of the whole picture of complex projects. And that's why you and I sat down and we created a 4.5-hour long discussion, a PM lecture on this topic. It is called Leadership Challenges of Complex Projects. And of course, it's available at pmlectures.com. Please tell our listeners what they will learn from these 4.5-hour long discussions on this topic.
Well, the things that they will learn out of that is a lot of this discussion we've had here on the issues between complexity science and chaos theory and how they interact. And of course, in the 4.5 hours, we don't go into the mathematics of all this. It's more of a esoteric discussion about those two areas and how they play into project management. But I think it is important to understand this whole idea with complexity theory and chaos theory and how the things that we understand from science and the world around us really have some very, very apropos business models. So that's what we're looking at is how do we take the seemingly abstract sort of thoughts and put it into a business model that works in our projects. That's very, very critical. We also introduce people some tools on how to how to measure complexity. And then we talk about these other ways to structure the projects for success, including the use of Monte Carlo and breaking down into some linear techniques. And then, as I recall, we also spent a considerable amount of time talking about leadership versus management and how it's important to be able to move between the two depending on the complexity of the project and what you're trying to accomplish. We also talked about structures and communications networks that need to exist and two very, very broad types of communication patterns that have to coexist simultaneously. And then we spent a lot of time talking about the balance and the shift between equilibrium and disequilibrium and why it's important to understand what happens as challenges tend to push a complex project out of equilibrium, how all of these other things that we've talked about, the dynamics of complexity science, the communication structure, how all of those things must be in place and must be very, very have some very dynamic adjustment as things move to disequilibrium because it allows you to recover very quickly without falling off the edge into pure chaos.
And this lecture is not just for people who are currently managing complex projects, right? This is also targeted at project managers leading medium, small-sized projects who want to get the tool sets onto their belt in understanding what it's like to manage a large project in the future, right?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I would say that if people are thinking about taking on a large project, it would be better to go through this material and learn more about what they're facing rather than to be in the middle of the fight and realize, I need to have my project structured differently. I need to have some other communication systems in place. Understand the dynamics about what you're going to take on before you get in the middle of it. Absolutely.
Wonderful. And two of the listeners here of the Project Management Podcast are going to be able to win this lecture of yours for free. And I'm going to repeat this after the interview again so that you can write it down one more time. A very simple way of participating. Simply send an email to my email address, pmpodcast@gmail.com. In the subject, write complex, the word complex, and in the email body, just tell me your name and the town and the country that you are writing from, and you get a chance to win one copy of Stan Levanduski's PM lecture, Leadership Challenges of Complex Project. Now, one word that has come up again and again throughout the discussion today was the word communications. And that's also my final question to you, because it seems an important aspect of managing complex projects. So, what then are the leadership challenges that we face when it comes to communications on our complex projects, Stan?
I think the biggest challenge with communications is to realize that in complex projects, we need to have two communications platforms, if you will, existing simultaneously. Mm-hmm. One is a very formal very formal structure for communications that most people are familiar with. And that would be modeled by a typical communications plan, sort of a matrix approach that might cover status reports and updates and dashboards and metrics and emails and voicemails and things like that. Very, very structured. And that gets this strategic information out to people. That's absolutely necessary. The problem is that system does not do a very good job with handling the real-time tactical kinds of communications. And in order to make that work, we spent a lot of time in the lecture talking about the dynamic, very adaptable peer-to-peer kind of communications network that must exist to take care of tactical types of issues that need solutions almost real time.
What kind of tools are we talking about here?
These can be anything from cell phones to BlackBerries to emails, to even some social networking tools like Twitter and things. It's not unusual technology, and it's things that people are very familiar with working with. The problem is, from a management perspective, in many companies, that we're taking the control out of the communications. And in fact, we need to do things to encourage people when they have a problem to find source of the solution and start on the solution rather than taking everything to the program manager. It's a different way of leading the project. It's more of a dynamic approach. And again, the difficult part of that shows up in the communications is the speed of the solution, the dynamics of the solution versus absolute control over what's going on. And some project managers, quite frankly, have a problem, some challenges in doing that. They don't like to give up that control.
Mm-hmm. All right. Once again, the lecture is called Leadership Challenges of Complex Projects. It's with Stan Levanduski and myself, and it can be found over at pmlectures.com. Stan, thank you so much for coming back on the program and discussing these challenges with us.
Absolutely. And the last comment that I have is people will also learn in this lecture series that the correct way to pronounce this amazing word
I
is...
know what's coming.
Equilibrium.
Yes, you mean equilibrium, right?
Something like that, yes.
All right. Thank you, Stan. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Cornelius. Goodbye.
And that was our discussion with Stan Levanduski on leadership challenges of complex projects. As a reminder, the complete lecture in which Stan teaches this topic in depth is 4.5 hours long and can be found at www.pmlectures.com. But of course, if you would like to win a copy of this lecture, then please go ahead and simply send an email to me at pmpodcast@gmail.com. Put the word complex into the subject and your name and town where you are writing from into the body. Your email has to reach me by March 21st, 2009. And of course, if you are a subscriber to the premium project management podcast, then you don't have to do anything because one of these lectures is reserved for you. So the listeners to the free podcast can win a copy, and the listeners to the premium podcast are automatically entered into winning the second copy. Stan is also the co-author of a book called The Advantage of Leadership, and you can find that at theadvantageofleadershipnow.com. On this page, you'll not only get a discount to the book, but also a number of free audio downloads. You can find a link to this page on the podcast website. And that's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time.